Faking a relationship for one weekend seemed simple, until the questions got too personal, the lies got too big, and the wedding took a turn I never saw coming. You ever get that gut feeling that you've just agreed to something that's about to completely ruin your life? Yeah, that was me last week. It all started when my friend, Jason, called me up with that voice he only uses when he's about to ask for a massive favor, like the time he needed me to help him move and forgot to mention he lived on the 5th floor with no elevator. I should have ignored the call. But like an idiot, I picked up. Jason sounded desperate, which should have been my first warning. His older sister, Emily, was heading to a massive family wedding, and she needed a date. Not just any date, a pretend boyfriend. Apparently, she'd been dodging relentless questions about her love life for years, and now, with her turning 30, the family pressure had escalated to absurd levels. Their relatives weren't the type to ask polite, casual questions. They turned interrogations into an art form. Aunts and uncles operated like detectives, cross-examining past relationships, demanding timelines, and even setting up accidental introductions with eligible bachelors. Emily had tried claiming she was seeing someone before, but the family's persistence always exposed the truth. That's where I came in. Jason needed me to step in as Emily's fake boyfriend for the entire wedding weekend. 3 full days of playing the role, holding hands at the right moments, and keeping nosy relatives from suspecting a thing. The plan sounded simple enough: smile, nod, throw in an affectionate glance here and there, and blend into the chaos. It should have been easy. But Jason had left out a few details, massive, life-ruining details. Like the fact that this wasn't just a wedding. It was a 3-day-long, tradition-packed, highly ritualistic, extended family extravaganza that involved multiple events, all requiring us to act convincingly in love. Rehearsal dinners, religious ceremonies, post-wedding brunches, it was a marathon, not a sprint. Or the fact that Emily's family was huge. Dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins, all deeply invested in each other's personal lives. There would be no slipping under the radar. Every conversation would be an opportunity for someone to pry, analyze, or test our so-called love story. And the biggest detail of all, the one that really made me question my life choices, Emily had a secret. A real boyfriend. A boyfriend who wasn't me, who her family didn't know about, and who, as far as I could tell, had no idea I was about to step into his role for the weekend. It was already too late to back out. I had officially made the worst decision of my life. The moment I arrived at the wedding venue, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. Jason had assured me it would be a low-stakes situation, just smile, hold hands, and avoid looking like an idiot. But as I stepped out of my car and took in the scene before me, it was clear that this wasn't just a wedding. It was a full-scale family reunion, cultural festival, and high-stakes drama production rolled into one. The estate was massive, with white tents stretched across an enormous lawn, fairy lights twinkling overhead even though it was still daylight. Fancy catering trucks lined the driveway, the smell of grilled meat and expensive champagne already filling the air. People bustled around in designer outfits, greeting each other with overly enthusiastic hugs and double-cheek kisses. This wasn't a casual family wedding, it was an event. Jason met me at the entrance, looking suspiciously relieved. That should have been my second warning. Okay, so, just a heads up, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Emily might have undersold how involved this wedding is. I wanted to turn around right then and there. Before I could process my growing regret, Emily appeared, looking effortlessly elegant in a pale blue dress that probably cost more than my rent. She was tall, poised, and had the kind of presence that made it obvious she wasn't used to being questioned. She extended her hand, and before I knew what was happening, she was pulling me into a picture-perfect embrace, pressing her cheek to mine like we were in some kind of romantic drama. "We have an audience," she whispered against my ear, and I stiffened as I noticed half a dozen pairs of eyes locked onto us. A group of older relatives stood nearby, their expressions ranging from mildly curious to outright skeptical. I barely had time to recover before Emily looped her arm through mine and led me forward like this was all perfectly normal. Introductions happened at lightning speed. There was an aunt who eyed me like a scientist studying a particularly untrustworthy lab specimen, an uncle who gave me a crushing handshake that felt more like a warning, and a set of twin cousins who immediately bombarded me with questions about how Emily and I had met. I had barely opened my mouth when Emily squeezed my hand in a silent message. "I've got this." She launched into a completely fabricated, highly detailed love story about how we had met at a bookstore, bonded over a shared love of classic literature, and started dating after a series of adorable, fate-driven encounters. She even threw in details about specific dates we had supposedly gone on, laughing at inside jokes that didn't actually exist. I tried to look appropriately smitten, nodding along as if I, too, remembered the moment she allegedly beat me at chess in a coffee shop. It was a masterful performance. I should have known then that this wasn't her first time lying to her family. Before I could process just how deep I was in, another relative approached. This one older, more commanding. A woman in an expensive sari, draped in gold jewelry that jingled as she walked. She studied me for an uncomfortable amount of time before finally speaking. "So, you are the one." I wasn't sure if it was a statement or a test. Either way, I suddenly felt like a fraud being interviewed for a job I hadn't applied for. "Yep," I said, keeping my voice light. "That's me." Then, as if things weren't already spiraling, she turned to Emily and asked a question that sent my stomach plummeting. "When will you be making the engagement official?" I barely stopped myself from choking on my own spit. Emily, to her credit, didn't even flinch. "Soon," she said smoothly. This was a full-blown disaster waiting to happen. I had experienced my fair share of awkward situations before, walking into the wrong bathroom, waving at someone who wasn't actually waving at me, accidentally liking a photo from 5 years ago while stalking an ex's profile. But standing there, hearing Emily casually announce our upcoming engagement to her entire family, that was a whole new level of panic. The worst part was how easily she did it. No hesitation, no flustered reaction, just a perfect, effortless lie slipping off her tongue like it was the most natural thing in the world. Meanwhile, I was still trying to remember if she had even mentioned this part of the plan. Spoiler, she hadn't. Fantastic. Now I wasn't just Emily's fake boyfriend. I was her fake fiancé. Jason, the traitor who had dragged me into this mess, was nowhere to be seen. Before I could fully process my growing regret, Emily tightened her grip on my arm and led me away from the crowd. She moved with purpose, weaving through clusters of chatting guests, only stopping when we were out of earshot behind a decorative hedge. She let out a slow breath. "Okay, that wasn't exactly planned." I crossed my arms. "You think?" She shot me a look but didn't argue. "Listen, I know this is a lot, but my family would have torn our story apart if they thought this was just some casual relationship. Saying we're engaged forces them to accept it instead of questioning every detail. It was insane. Completely, utterly insane. Yet, looking back toward the crowd, I realized she might actually have a point. The moment her announcement had been made, the interrogations had stopped. Instead of demanding proof of our relationship, her relatives had simply accepted it as fact. That didn't make me feel any better. Before I could argue, a voice over the speakers announced the start of the pre-wedding dinner. Emily straightened, smoothing out her dress. The dining setup was grand, with fairy lights overhead and waiters moving gracefully between tables. As soon as we sat, I realized there was no escaping more questions. Every relative within earshot had advice to share, stories to tell, or deeply personal questions to ask. How many kids were we planning to have? Would we live near her parents? Had we already picked out a venue? Emily, of course, handled it all effortlessly, while I nodded along, trying not to choke on my food. Then, just as I was convincing myself that I could survive this dinner, the entire atmosphere shifted. The doors at the back of the venue swung open. A man walked in. Emily froze. Jason, who had finally resurfaced, immediately knocked over his water glass in pure panic. The tension at the table skyrocketed. Even without being told, I knew exactly who the new arrival was. Emily's real boyfriend had just shown up. The second he walked in, I knew this was about to go from bad to worse. Emily, who had been handling the entire night with flawless confidence, suddenly looked like she had been hit by a freight train. Her fingers curled tightly around her fork, her entire posture stiffened, and her eyes locked onto the man standing at the entrance like he was a threat she hadn't prepared for. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The entire table seemed to sense the shift in energy. Jason, seated a few spots down, had turned an alarming shade of pale. The man, Nathan, if I had to guess, didn't seem remotely fazed by the attention. He was tall, confident, and unlike every other guest in the room, not dressed in formal wedding attire. He didn't look like someone who had been invited. He looked like someone who had crashed this event with a purpose. And that purpose, judging by the way he was striding straight toward our table, had everything to do with Emily. Jason muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like a curse. I was inclined to agree. Nathan reached us far too quickly. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to prepare for impact. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Are we going to talk about this?" The words weren't loud, but they might as well have been shouted through a megaphone. The entire table fell silent. Emily didn't turn to look at him. Her jaw clenched. Her grip on the fork tightened. But her voice, when she finally spoke, remained controlled. "Not here." That clearly wasn't the answer he wanted. His jaw tensed, but he kept his composure, though I could feel the energy radiating off him. "Not here," he repeated, voice calmer than it should have been. I, meanwhile, was still trying to figure out the best course of action. Should I play along? Pretend I didn't know who this guy was? Try to de-escalate whatever was about to happen? Before I could decide, Nathan exhaled sharply and shook his head. Fine, we'll talk later. It was a retreat, but not a surrender. He wasn't done. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving a silence so thick I could practically hear everyone's unspoken questions filling the space he had left behind. Meanwhile, Emily's aunt leaned forward, her eyes still locked on Nathan's retreating figure. That man seems very interested in you, Emily, she said, her voice sugary but sharp. Odd, don't you think? Emily's smile was immediate. It was also completely fake. Not odd at all, she said smoothly. Nathan's just a friend. He was probably just surprised I hadn't told him the news yet. And just like that, the lie grew even bigger. I needed a drink. Badly. If there was ever a time to drink myself into oblivion, this was it. Nathan's arrival had left a thick tension hanging over the table, but Emily acted as if nothing had happened. She smiled, nodded along to conversations, and ignored the fact that her real boyfriend had just witnessed her fake engagement. Jason, meanwhile, looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and never resurface. A waiter passed by, and I grabbed a drink without hesitation. I had a feeling I'd need it. Emily's aunt, still suspicious, leaned forward. So, how did you propose? Jason choked. Emily smiled sweetly. Oh, you tell them, honey. I froze. There were at least 10 people watching me, waiting for some grand, romantic story. My brain short-circuited, and before I could stop myself, I launched into the most dramatic proposal story imaginable. I took her back to where we had our first date, a little bookstore downtown. She picked up her favorite book and found the ring inside. The table collectively gasped. Someone wiped away a tear. Emily, ever the actress, squeezed my hand. It was perfect. Jason poured himself another drink. But just as I started to believe we had pulled it off, I noticed Nathan, standing near the entrance, watching everything. And he did not look happy. The evening had been filled with close calls, but avoiding the inevitable was no longer an option. Nathan had been watching from the moment he arrived, his presence a storm waiting to break. His patience had run out, and now there was nowhere left to hide. Stepping outside for air offered no escape. He was already there, waiting with an expression that left no room for doubt. There was no need for raised voices or dramatics. The weight of unspoken accusations was enough. Tension settled in the space between them as he searched for answers. There was no hesitation in the way he carried himself, no uncertainty in his presence. The look in his eyes wasn't just frustration. It was betrayal wrapped in disbelief. The conversation that followed wasn't loud, but it was heavy. It was clear that the charade hadn't fooled him. Every lie told throughout the evening had only made things worse. The truth hadn't been buried deep enough. He had already started digging, and it was only a matter of time before he reached the bottom. Emily arrived before things could escalate further, her expression carefully composed. The confrontation shifted the moment she stepped in, though the tension remained. It was no longer about exposing a lie. It was about the fallout that would come next. Words were exchanged, each one sharpening the edges of an already fragile situation. Nathan's disappointment cut deeper than any direct accusation could. There was nothing left to say that would change the outcome. He wasn't walking away because he was satisfied. He was walking away because this was far from over. Jason appeared just as the confrontation ended, his presence offering nothing in the way of relief. The problem hadn't been solved, only postponed. As Nathan disappeared into the night, the reality of the situation finally settled in. Emily barely moved, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed the effort it took to maintain her composure. Jason's silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. Everything had officially spiraled out of control. The silence stretched long after Nathan disappeared into the night. Emily stood still, eyes fixed on the spot where he had been, her fingers pressing lightly against her temple. Jason had retreated into quiet discomfort, shifting his weight as if hoping the earth might swallow him whole. Nothing about the evening had gone as planned. The lie had barely lasted a full day before cracks started showing. Now, instead of dodging nosy relatives, there was an entirely new problem, one that came with the sharp edges of real emotions. Back inside, the wedding celebrations continued undisturbed. Laughter carried through the open doors, music spilled into the night, and guests clinked glasses in blissful ignorance. The chaos unfolding in the shadows remained unseen by everyone except those entangled in it. Emily finally exhaled, a slow and measured breath, before turning away from the empty space Nathan had left behind. There was no outburst, no visible unraveling, just a quiet determination to move forward as if nothing had happened. Jason followed as she walked back toward the venue, his shoulders tense with the weight of everything unsaid. The words he wanted to speak never found their way out. The moment the three of them stepped back inside, the warmth of the wedding swallowed them whole. Conversations hummed, drinks flowed, and the illusion of a perfect evening remained intact. Emily slipped seamlessly into her role once more, her expression smooth, her laughter at all the right moments. But something had changed. The act, once effortless, had a new layer of strain beneath it. The ease with which she had woven the story earlier now seemed thinner, more delicate, as if the next gust of wind might finally tear it apart. The night stretched on, an exhausting dance of dodging questions and maintaining appearances. Small moments of reprieve came in flashes, brief sips of champagne, empty corners where no one was watching, pauses that allowed for quiet breaths. But nothing lasted long. Then, the inevitable happened. Another relative, one more observant than the rest, pulled Emily aside. There was a softness to the way they spoke, an intimacy that suggested they had known her since childhood. Their words weren't accusations, but concern. Was she happy? Truly happy? The carefully built mask held firm, but the hesitation in Emily's answer was almost imperceptible. The lie had survived scrutiny all night, but under the weight of genuine care, it wavered. Jason lingered nearby, pretending not to listen, but his expression tightened. Even he could see it now. This wasn't sustainable, and the wedding weekend had only just begun. The night had already gone on too long, yet there was no sign of slowing down. The wedding reception stretched into the early hours, and with every passing minute, the weight of the lie became heavier. Conversations blurred together, but the questions never stopped. The family had accepted the engagement without hesitation, but their curiosity had only grown. Each relative had their own approach. Some were warm and eager, pressing for sweet details, while others were more skeptical, picking at the edges of the story as if waiting for a seam to unravel. Emily handled it all with careful precision, never missing a beat. She had an answer for everything, a smile that reassured, and a laugh that diffused suspicion. But beneath it all, something had shifted. The earlier confidence had been replaced by something harder to define. Jason had withdrawn, avoiding eye contact as much as possible, blending into the background whenever he could. He was in survival mode now, hoping to make it through the weekend with minimal casualties. The real problem was me. Unlike Emily, I hadn't spent years perfecting the art of dodging family interrogations. The constant stream of questions felt like a battlefield, each interaction a potential landmine. I was supposed to know the details, the little things that made relationships real. What was Emily's favorite flower? How did she take her coffee? What had drawn me to her in the first place? Each time, I pulled answers from thin air, hoping they aligned with whatever story she had already crafted. A wrong answer would be dangerous. A hesitation would be worse. The tension came to a head when Emily's grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman with a soft voice, took me aside. Her approach was different from the others. She wasn't looking for gossip or entertainment. She was looking for truth. "You seem like a good man," she said, watching me closely. "But love is not just in the grand gestures. It's in the details, the things only two people in love would know. A test." She smiled as she asked the simplest of questions. "What's her middle name?" It should have been easy. The kind of thing a fiancé would know without thinking. But my mind went blank. Emily was across the room, deep in conversation with an uncle who was probably planning the wedding in his head. There was no way to ask for help, no way to subtly check for the right answer. The silence stretched too long. Her grandmother's expression softened, as if she had found the answer she was looking for, just not the one I wanted. "Love doesn't hesitate," she murmured, before gently patting my arm and walking away. The moment was small, quiet, but the damage was done. The questions wouldn't stop, and now, neither would the doubts. The wedding celebrations showed no sign of ending. Every event bled into the next, an endless cycle of toasts, dances, and forced laughter. The weight of the lie pressed down heavier with each passing hour. Emily was still holding everything together, at least on the surface. She smiled in all the right places, nodded along to conversations as if nothing was unraveling behind the scenes. But something had changed. The effortless charm had started to crack, the perfectly rehearsed answers now requiring just a little more thought. Jason kept his distance, likely counting down the hours until this entire mess was behind him. He had always known this was a terrible idea, and now he was watching it fall apart in real time. And then there was Nathan. He hadn't approached again after their last encounter, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He moved through the crowd like a storm cloud waiting to break, always lingering just close enough to remind everyone that this wasn't over. The worst part wasn't his anger. It was the way he watched Emily. There was no doubt in his mind that she was lying. He was just waiting for her to admit it. The moment everything truly fell apart was at the next morning's brunch. It was supposed to be simple, a casual family gathering before the final events of the wedding weekend, but the night before had left an imprint. Whispers had already begun to spread. Emily's grandmother had clearly shared her doubts with a few others, and from there, skepticism had taken root. Someone had asked why there hadn't been an official engagement announcement. Another relative wondered aloud why Emily hadn't introduced me sooner. The questions, subtle at first, started stacking up. Emily kept dodging, but the room felt different now. People weren't just curious, they were watching. And then, Nathan spoke. His voice cut through the polite chatter, not loud, but clear enough for everyone at the table to hear. "I just have one question," he said, setting down his coffee. "If you're so in love, why haven't you even kissed once this whole weekend?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily's hand tightened around her fork. Jason visibly tensed, bracing for impact. Eyes turned toward us, expectant, waiting for an answer that couldn't be given. For the first time since this had all started, Emily didn't have a quick response. The mask slipped, and just like that, the lie began to crumble. The moment stretched unbearably long. Nathan's question had changed everything. The room, once filled with easy chatter and the clinking of silverware, had fallen silent. Eyes shifted toward Emily, waiting for an answer that should have been effortless. But no words came. The weight of expectation pressed down, suffocating the lie that had held together for days. Emily, always composed, always ready with a perfect response, hesitated. And that hesitation was enough. Her grandmother was the first to speak, her voice steady but filled with quiet disappointment. She didn't demand an explanation or raise her voice. She simply asked for the truth. Emily exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders finally giving way. There was no salvaging it anymore, no clever excuse that could make the question disappear. She admitted it then, softly, that the engagement wasn't real. The reaction around the table was subtle but undeniable. A few relatives exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others looking away. Jason lowered his gaze, unwilling to witness what came next. Emily continued, her voice quieter now, explaining that she had never meant for it to spiral this far. The pressure from her family had worn her down, the constant questions about when she would settle, when she would start a family, when she would finally fit into the mold they had envisioned for her. She had only wanted a moment of peace, a weekend free from scrutiny. But in trying to escape the weight of their expectations, she had built something even heavier. Nathan said nothing. He remained still, watching her, but whatever he had come here to fight for seemed to fade in that moment. There was nothing left to challenge. The truth was out, and it was enough. Without another word, he turned and walked away. Her grandmother stood next, her disappointment clear, though she didn't say anything more. Others followed, some muttering to each other, some simply retreating, unwilling to be part of the aftermath. The unraveling had begun, not with an explosion, but with a quiet, inevitable collapse. Jason let out a breath beside her, a half-hearted attempt to lighten the mood, but the damage had already been done. Emily turned to look at me, apology written all over her face, but I only shook my head slightly. There was nothing left to say. This had been her battle, and she had fought it the only way she knew how. The wedding weekend wasn't over, but for Emily, the illusion was. There would be more conversations, more explanations, more fallout. But that was hers to handle now. I stood, offering nothing more than a brief pat on her shoulder before walking away from the wreckage. This had never been my fight to begin with.